Hey, welcome to our explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a word you've probably heard a million times, a word that's sparked revolutions and shaped entire countries, socialism. So, what does it actually mean? Let's get into it. To really get to the heart of socialism, we have to start with a question, and it's a big one. Why is it that in a world with so much wealth, there are still these huge gaps between the rich and the poor? This very question has literally been the engine for massive political movements for centuries. And that question, well, it brings us to a really specific point in history. Think about the Industrial Revolution. You've got factories popping up everywhere, completely changing the world. But at the same time, the gap between the wealthy factory owners and the workers, who were often in just awful conditions, well, that gap became impossible to ignore. And it was right there in that environment that a powerful new idea started to grow. Okay, so to really wrap our heads around what socialism is, we've got to look at where it came from. The story of how this idea evolved is actually pretty fascinating. So as you can see, this idea didn't just appear out of nowhere. It really builds over time. It all kicks off with this revolutionary energy in the 1700s, but it gets a huge boost during the Industrial Revolution, thanks to thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They're the ones who really laid out the critique that capitalism was, by its very nature, exploitative. And by the time we hit the 20th century, wow, these aren't just ideas in a book anymore. They're fueling the creation of labor unions, political parties, and they even become the inspiration for the welfare states and decolonization movements that shaped the modern world. So all of these different moments, all these movements, they're all connected by one central core idea. So let's break down exactly what that is. Okay, here it is, the core definition. Socialism is basically the idea that the things we use to create wealth, the factories, the land, the big machinery, what economists call the means of production, shouldn't be owned by private individuals or corporations. Instead, they should be owned by society as a whole. It's kind of like the difference between a public park that everyone can use and a private backyard. Socialism wants to apply that public park idea to the economy. But what does social ownership really mean, like in practice? Well, it means that society, all of us together, gets to decide how these essential resources are used. The whole point isn't to make a profit for a handful of people. The goal is to produce what's actually needed for the good of everyone. And social ownership isn't just one single thing either. It can take a few different forms. For example, you've got state ownership, where the government manages things for everybody. Then there's cooperative ownership. This is where workers actually own and run the company themselves. And you can even have community ownership, where resources are controlled by a local group. And this is a really important point to get. Socialism is not a monolith. It's not one single instruction manual. It's a whole spectrum of ideas. And they have some very different opinions on how to get to a more equal society. Let's look at the big three here. On one end of the spectrum, you have revolutionary socialism. The name says it all, right? The goal is to completely overthrow the capitalist system. Then, in the middle, you have democratic socialism. These folks want to build a socialist economy, but, and this is key, they want to do it using a democratic political system. And then you've got social democracy. Their goal isn't to get rid of capitalism entirely. Instead, they want to reform it, to make it fairer, using things like a strong welfare state and smart regulations. All right, so that's the history and the theory, but what does this look like in the real world? Let's take a look at where we can actually see socialist ideas in practice today. And you might be surprised to find out that a lot of policies you're probably familiar with in modern democracies actually have their roots in socialist thought. The biggest example, the welfare state. This is just the idea that the government has a responsibility to make sure everyone has a basic standard of living. We're talking about things like public schools and healthcare for all. The Nordic countries are probably the most famous example of this. They have what's called a mixed economy. So they've blended a capitalist, market-based system with a really strong welfare state. What does that mean? It means they have things like universal health care and education paid for by taxes, powerful labor unions that fight for workers, and a solid social safety net. And all of this exists right alongside private businesses.
But it's not all about big state-level policies. Socialist ideas can also change the workplace itself, and that's through a concept called worker self-management. So just imagine for a second, a company where the people who work there are also the owners. That's a worker cooperative. The workers themselves vote on everything, from how much they get paid to what the company produces. And if there's any profit left over, what they call a surplus, it's either shared among the workers or put right back into the business or the local community. It's basically democracy, but for the workplace. Okay, so all of this brings us to one of the biggest debates of the last couple of centuries, the huge ideological clash between socialism and capitalism. This really gets to the heart of the difference. Let's break it down. Under capitalism, private individuals own the stuff that makes stuff, and the number one goal is profit. The government tends to stay out of it. Under socialism, society owns that stuff, and the motivation is totally different. It's about meeting everyone's needs and creating equality. And to do that, the government naturally plays a much bigger role in planning and providing for people. This quote from Karl Marx really nails the socialist critique of capitalism. The argument goes like this. Sure, a worker is technically free to choose their job, but because they don't own any of the factories or tools, there's a massive power imbalance. They are, as Marx said, compelled, or forced, really, to sell their labor just to survive. Socialists argue that this makes the whole relationship unequal from the very start. But of course, the conversation doesn't stop there. For every flaw that socialism points out in capitalism, critics have some pretty significant arguments against socialism itself. So, what are the big criticisms? Well, here are the main ones you'll hear. Does it lead to a government with way too much control over our lives? If you take away the profit motive, what's the incentive to work hard and innovate? Does the economy just stall? And maybe most importantly, is it dangerous to put that much economic and political power into the hands of the state? One of the most famous arguments against it is something called the economic calculation problem. Okay, stick with me here. Economists like Mises and Hayek basically said that without prices set by a free market, a centrally planned economy can't work. A planner's basically flying blind. Think about it. How do you know how many shoes to make or how much bread to bake if you don't have prices telling you what people want and how much it costs to make things? They argued it's impossible to allocate resources efficiently. So, after all that, where does this leave us? Well, this debate is hundreds of years old, but it is far from over. You could actually argue it's more relevant today than ever before. And I think this quote really captures the heart of the whole conversation. How wealth is spread around in a society, that's not just some law of nature, like gravity. It's the result of political choices. The choices we make about the kind of systems we want to live in. And that really leads us to our final big question for you to think about. When you look at the future, with huge challenges like automation taking jobs, inequality that just won't go away, and all sorts of global crises, well, the original questions that socialism tried to answer are suddenly right back in the spotlight. This whole debate about how we should organize our economy and who really benefits from it, that's not just history. It's a live debate about the kind of future we're all going to build together.